Hi, folks. Thanks for joining in. Hope all of you are doing great and most important, staying safe. This is our 39th Silicon Valley IAM meetup, and today we have David Brossard from Salesforce to talk about authorization. I knew David from his days at Axiomatics, and if you are new to Axiomatics, it's one of the leaders in the dynamic authorization domain. And now David is a senior director of product management at Salesforce, who oversees the design and development of Salesforce identity offering, including CIAM and Enterprise Identity. So if you have any questions during this session, please share them over the YouTube chat and I'll pass them over to David. Over to you, David.
All right, thanks, Prabhath. Happy to be here, happy to be talking about authorization. It's kind of funny how this topic has been following me forever, given that I don't do authorization in my day-to-day life anymore. But like Prabhath said, I previously worked at Axiomatics and for 10 years focusing on everything authorization using standards like ABAC, ZACL, and Alpha. So a few months ago, I had the privilege to be talking at Identiverse to talk about the future of authorization and how things are going to evolve. And this is kind of this presentation. I can share the link to the slides with you. They're public. They're in Google Slides, so you could all check them out. But let's go ahead and get started. First of all, a lot of conferences, as you probably all know, and even IAM meetups are no longer in person. They're all online. So we're in 2021 and we're somewhere online. I'm dialing in from Canada, as it would be. I'm assuming most of you are in the Bay. And we're going to be talking about authorization. Okay, great. But what is exactly authorization? Like, could anyone really give me a good definition? Oftentimes when I ask people, they'll say, well, authorization is when you get authentication wrong. You know, if I don't put in the right username and password, I'm going to get an HTTP 401. And what does HTTP 401 stand for? Well, it's unauthorized. So failed authentication is equal to authorization. That's not quite true, of course. And most of you here, given that you're in the IAM meetup, you're very well familiar with the distinction between authorization and authentication. But these misnomers, these problems with the wording are kind of plaguing authorization and making it harder to define. Yeah. So if it's not about authentication, then surely authorization is about OAuth, right? And OAuth is about authorization. After all, OAuth does stand for open authorization. Yeah, but no, not really either. Because OAuth is more about access delegation. If you think about it, OAuth was developed to avoid what's known as the password empty pattern, sharing your password with the service. And OAuth was developed so that you could connect your Facebook, as an example, to your Twitter, or connect your Mint to your bank account and be able to share information between the two on your behalf. So it's all about access delegation. Yes, access delegation is part of authorization, if you will, but it's not authorization as a whole, and OAuth is not authorization, or at least it's only one tiny sliver of what authorization should be. Authorization, the way I like to define it at the end of the day, is in the broadest possible sense. It's about granting or denying an entity access to another entity. That's all there is to authorization. Very, very simple. And what I mean by that, it's interesting to note that it's both granting and denying. It's not just a positive case. It could be both a negative and a positive case, right? And an entity could be a human, it could be a client, it could be a user, it could be another application, and another entity, similarly, could be an application, it could be a data set, it could be many, many different things, right? And to make sure that only the right people or the right entities get access to the right data or the right resources, in the middle, bam, you're going to do authorization. Now, if you're familiar with Monty Python, you might have recognized some of the characters here on the slide. This is going to be the theme for the whole presentation, so bear with me. So let's have a look at some of the definitions and requirements for what I like to see as authorization. So first of all, I would like to redefine authentication. Oftentimes, authentication is about proving your identity, but actually you could see it in a broader sense and define authentication about proving a claim about something. So as an example, if you go to a bar and you want to drink an alcoholic beverage, you have to prove you're 21 or 18, depending on where you live. That has nothing to do with your identity. It has everything to do with your date of birth. However, with the claim that you're 21 or not 21. And as a matter of fact, you could even argue that date of birth isn't what matters. What matters is that you are 21. Whether you're born in May or April or whatever, or 1940 or 1960, it doesn't matter. Are you 21? Yes or no? So authentication is about proving that claim, okay, in the broadest sense possible. Authorization is actually taking that information, taking these claims that we know about the entity and determining based on those claims or attributes whether access should be granted to whatever it is they're trying to do. And of course, I'm talking about the attributes from the user, from the end user, but it could also be attributes of what it is you're trying to get access to. So a good example would be, well, I'm the owner of this bank account and I want to get access to the bank account. Can I get access to the bank account? Well, let's see. Is there something that says that the owner of an account can view the account? Probably is. Great. We looked at the user's identity in this case. We looked at the account's ownership. That's an attribute of the account. And if they're equal, then access should be granted. So that's authorization in the broadest possible sense. The challenge, though, is that authorization doesn't just sit in one nice little silo. You know, why am I calling it the Holy Grail? Why am I making such a big deal about authorization? The problem with authorization is that it ties in multiple different concepts. Authentication is, quote, easy. It's not easy, but we've been there. We've tackled it over the past 10, 15, 20 years. We've matured authentication. We know how to handle it pretty well. But more importantly, authentication tends to sit in the hands of the IT team responsible for AD, responsible for your LDAP, responsible for your identity sources. Authentication is just in the hands of one single team that will be able to service all of the applications within the enterprise. Authorization isn't that way. Authorization requires, yes, authentication and identity data and your LDAP and your AD, but also requires information from the application you're trying to protect. So now you're kind of sitting, the way that I like to paint it as an analogy is that you're kind of stuck in between two chairs, right? The enterprise IT team handling authentication, but the business side of the business of the company handling the business application and the requirements for that business application and the authorization needs for that business applications. It's harder to tackle authorization simply because it ties in these different angles, these different dimensions. I'm going to pause here for a couple seconds. Any questions?
Yeah, David. So from the application's point of view, do you think authorization can be done without authentication, or in other words, authentication is a must that needs to be done prior to authorization?
So it depends what you mean with authentication, but you could have, as long as you have claims or attributes or information that you know is trustworthy, that you've authenticated, then you could actually do authorization. It doesn't have to be about an end user authenticating and putting in a username and password. Generally it is, though, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so that's all we have.
An analogy in a way would be, when you go through immigration, you show your passport, you're not really authenticating as in you're saying, hey, I'm David. What you're showing is that, yeah, you have an American passport, you can enter the US. You have a Canadian passport, you can enter Canada. It's not really about Joe, the Canadian. It's just about the fact that you have the right passport to enter the country. So it's different degrees of what you're proving with your authentication.
And that's what we see in OAuth flow too, right? So you get a token won't say who you are, but it'll say what you can do.
Exactly. And actually, it has some nice consequences, because sometimes you don't want to reveal the end user's identity. Either it's not relevant, or for privacy reasons, you don't want to reveal that information. You just want to reveal whatever information is necessary to do what it is you need to do. Yep. Yeah,
thanks.
So there are 5 basic authorization requirements that I think of when I talk about authorization. 1, it should be configurable and decoupled. So when I say configurable and decoupled, what I mean is you should be able to write an app or write a service or write an application, whatever it might be, okay, one thing or data store. And independently of that app or microservice or data store, you want to be able to define your authorization in a decoupled, configurable way. So decoupled, if you change the app, you don't have to necessarily rework your authorization framework. If you if instead of the app changing, the legal requirements change, you should be able to adapt the authorization without having to rewrite the app. So that's what configurable and decoupled means. So this kind of tends to mean that you're going to have to look at things like either policy-based authorization or authorization frameworks that let you configure authorization through configuration language or policy, and then be able to plug the app into that framework so that you can actually tackle the authorization. The second aspect is that your authorization should be future-proof, meaning that if you were building authorization right into the app, you would be building the requirements that you're aware of today, right? If you're building a banking app, you know that today you have to comply with this piece of legislation, that piece of legislation. You know that you want to deal with this type of business and that type of retail customer, but tomorrow you might have new requirements. So your authorization framework should be able to adapt to those new requirements and be able to quickly address them, again, through the configuration aspect that we mentioned, point number 1. And then point number 5, the authorization should be auditable. What I mean by that is it's important to be able to define authorization and say, hey, this can happen, this can't happen. But also you want to be able to prove what did happen. So you want to have an audit trail of all of the authorization that was consumed. Much like when you do authentication, you want to have an audit trail of all of the successful and failed authentication attempts. And in authorization, you also want to know what can potentially happen. Given a set of authorization configuration, what can happen? Is this possible? And that's important because you're going to have to prove your compliance, your authorization compliance to the legal team within a business, or maybe the business application owners who want to verify that the authorization scenarios are correctly put into place. So these are the 5/3 main authorization requirements that we have: configurable and decoupled, future-proof, and auditable. The head of privacy at Twitter had a really nice expression for the auditable piece. He was saying that the any language for authorization needs to be reverse indexable. And what he meant by that is that if you have a language that says, okay, A can access B, the way the language is written, it needs to be reversible or reverse indexable so that we can ask, okay, given B, what can happen? Or given A, what can happen? So that's kind of an important aspect to the auditable piece. Now, a presentation wouldn't be complete without an authorization Venn. So here's more Venn diagram. Here's my beautiful Venn diagram that I'm very proud of. There's 3 different aspects to authorization if you want it to be complete. One, of course, is the identity of the user. Okay. Number 2 is the entity that you're trying to get access to. And number 3 is the contextual aspects of the interaction. So if you think about, and we'll get into that in the following slides, if you think about traditional authorization mechanisms, they tend to be very identity centric. So you only have the circle on the left. But if you start taking authorization in the broader sense, then you see that you have contextual information that kicks in, you have the entity that kicks in. The combination of the 3 will give you fine-grained authorization that can tackle your legal requirements and your business requirements. Different kinds of authorization that I've noticed over the years: functional authorization. As a whole, can a user view bank accounts? As a whole, can a user print? Functional authorization is super useful when you're building UIs or you want to dynamically generate scopes or claims inside of an OAuth access token or a JOT token. It's mainly about things that as a whole users can do. It's not about a specific item. That takes us to the second type of authorization, transactional authorization. That's the one we're most familiar with, especially in the API world. When you have a transaction where a user is trying to get access to a specific item, then you're going to ask, can Alice view account 123? Okay, that's transactional authorization. And then there's a third aspect, which is data-centric authorization, which is essentially the same as transactional, but at scale. When Alice wants to view accounts, but she doesn't know which accounts, or she has millions she could potentially get access to, you're not going to be asking the question, can Alice view account 1, account 2, account 3? It wouldn't scale. So you have to be able to flip the question around and ask, which accounts can Alice view? Okay, and that's what's going to give you data-centric authorization, and hopefully the framework that you're using will let you generate filters that you can then apply to whatever data store you're using in the backend.
One question, David.
Yeah.
So I read one of your previous slides, which you talked about the requirements.
Yep.
Do you think these authorization requirements are similar for SaaS versus custom-built applications?
I would think so. The challenge with SaaS is that you might not have as much flexibility, but yes. So that's actually a really interesting question. If you bought a CRM SaaS, so you could pick Salesforce, you could pick, there's a lot of different competitors. What is going to make you choose one versus the other? Is it the usability? Is it the business aspects? Is it the reliability? Or is it, for instance, how easily you can configure authorization within that SaaS? And are you going to have to rely on the features built inside the SaaS, or can you externalize the authorization from the SaaS? Okay, that's actually a really, really good question. What I've seen so far is not a lot of SaaS have put a lot of thought in fine-grained authorization, if you will, or if they did, it's proprietary to that particular SaaS. So Salesforce has a very rich authorization model, but it's Salesforce only. So it works great for Salesforce, but you can't use it anywhere else. Take another SaaS, Expensify. They do have a level of authorization. Maybe it's enough for Expensify, but again, it's built into the SaaS. It's not externalized, and therefore it makes it harder to audit and potentially configure. There are companies that do try to address the authorization challenge for SaaS. Companies like Savient that do kind of the governance of different authorization solutions across multiple SaaS. And I'm sure there's others that I can't think of, but it's definitely a slightly different problem because you're relying now on how easily the authorization can be decoupled from the SaaS or can be configured through the SaaS. So it's a really good question.
Yeah, thanks, David.
You bet. So another aspect to authorization is who defines authorization? Up to now, most of what I've said was kind of biased towards the enterprise side of things. You write an app. As the app owner, the business app owner, you define what you want to have happen in your app, who can view accounts, who can edit accounts, who can transfer money, all that sort of stuff. So that's all very much enterprise driven. But there is also a side where the user can decide what can happen. Great example of that would be user consent. If I want to share my medical data with you, Prabhath, I should be able to do that. Or if I wanted to give you access to my bank account as a guardian, then I should be able to do that. So we clearly see that there's two sides to authorization. Authorization that is defined by the enterprise and authorization that is defined by the data owner. Okay, so you could see enterprise as the data steward and the user-driven data owner. Okay. Within the enterprise, there could be multiple sources. It could be the business app owner. It could be the legal department. It could be the compliance department. It could be many different sources, but they're all enterprise side, meaning these are authorization or policies defined by the business and imposed on the user. Now, when do we authorize? Historically, there are really just two places where you can check for authorization and decide. Historically, it's been very much design time, meaning that the user is created, we give them a role, we give them a set of claims, and with those claims, we let the application do whatever it wants to do with the application. But the permissions, if you will, permissions, were granted at the definition time of the user. Ideally, we want to move to more runtime because if you remember the Venn diagram where you have context in there, if you want to be able to use context, you have to be able to make decisions right there and then. In an API world, it means that you might want to do authorization within your API gateway or your microservices gateway in the microservices world, or something that would intercept your business flow right before it hits what it is it's trying to do. So these are the two different types of when we can do authorization. Just in time, runtime, or design time. Now, something that came up a lot with my customers in my previous life was, well, David, what you're talking about really is it's not authorization, it's business logic. Like, if I want a user to be able to transfer $1,000 per day or per month, that's business logic, that's not authorization. And it is really hard to draw the line between authorization and business logic. There's kind of a fuzzy gray line. My rule of thumb typically is that if you want to be able to report on whatever it is you're doing, if you care about it, if you want it to show up in audit reports, and if you want to have to tell your compliance teams that you're doing this and that, then it's authorization. If you don't care about reporting on it, then you could let it be in your business logic. It doesn't really matter that much. Now, we're halfway through the presentation almost, and I've only just been giving out requirements and definitions for authorization. And you might be like, well, this is something that I've been tackling for the past 20 years. I do roles, I do identities. I'm pretty okay with what I do. I can build an app pretty quickly. I can, if the app requirements change, I can rewrite my app really quickly as well. So why even bother? Like, why is authorization such a big deal? I can do all of that in my code. I can do all of that through my roles and claims and so on and so forth and OAuth. It's plenty enough. Is it though? Is it plenty enough? Can we do better? Like, what's the impetus for looking at fine-grained authorization? And I think in part, it's because we have way more data, way more users, way more applications than ever before, way more needs to prove compliance as well, and the need to adapt more quickly. And so rewriting applications all the time is not going to work. Relying on roles and identities is not going to scale well enough. So with that being said, let's look at the existing state of the art. And before I do that, any additional questions, Prabhath?
Yeah. So David, you talked about different kinds of authorization: functional, transactional, and data-centric.
Yep.
And also you talked about decoupling the authorization logic from application logic as a requirement.
Yep.
So out of these three kinds, functional, transactional, data-centric, which one you believe the hardest to decouple from the application logic?
So I think the easiest is transactional, because the architectural patterns are moving towards, and have moved in the past 15 years to API driven. This very well, right, from your past life. So transactional is probably the easiest one to achieve. Okay, the hardest one is the second easiest, I'm going to say, is going to be functional, although functional is going to require tighter coupling between the application and the authorization framework, because if what it is controlling what shows up in a UI and you want to enable widgets and disable widgets, that's going to require tighter integration between the app and the authorization framework. But the hardest one by far is the data-centric authorization, for sure, because you have to go essentially from the authorization policy to something that is capable of filtering data. And the filtering, of course, is going to be specific to how the data is stored. If it's SQL, or you're talking, maybe you're working with Hibernate as a framework, or you're talking to a Snowflake, or you're talking to a Hadoop, and therefore the filters that you need are different because these use different languages. So that's probably the hardest bit.
Yeah, I think Axiomatics implement a database driver, right? Kind of.
They do, yeah. There's Axiomatics. I think Informatica has something similar as well. So there's different solutions out there, but it's definitely not an easy feat.
Yeah, I think Oracle probably they have inbuilt feature to the database.
Yeah. So actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because fine-grained authorization, in a way, although it's now becoming a thing, it's actually not that new. And if we go back 20 years before the API phase and so on and so forth, the big companies like Oracle, like IBM, were looking at fine-grained, they called it FGAC, fine-grained access control for data. And they had a way to do that, very much that sort of stuff on their databases. Oracle had a product, and they might still do, called VPD, Virtual Private Database, that would let them do some level of filtering on their databases. So way back then, the data teams had already realized the need for finer-grained authorization. Yeah, this is a very good point.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah.
So let's look at the current state of the art. And I didn't go as far back as Oracle and VPD. That, I guess that's for another presentation. I want to define three words: model, standard, and framework. So model is going to be things like ACLs, access control lists, RBAC, role-based access control, and ABAC, attribute-based access control. And I'm sure there's many other models out there. Oftentimes what you'll see is that companies and people will rehash ABAC into a specific model. So you might have heard of RELBAC, relationship-based access control. It's very much the same thing as ABAC, maybe done differently, but the effects, the results are very similar. You might hear a term called RBAC, risk-based access control. Yes, using the term RBAC for something else than role-based access control is not a great idea, but some people have done it. So there we go. But at the end of the day, everything is really just ABAC. The second aspect is standard. Okay. And I've personally gone back and forth on the importance of standards. Standards really matter when there's a lot of interoperability. So think OAuth, OpenID Connect, SAML, there's a lot of interoperability. In authorization, it's not as obvious. Yes, we do have standards. We have SAML, XAML, OAuth. We have Open Policy Agent is borderline standard/framework. But does the standard matter as much in authorization where you're not going to be exchanging your policies or your configuration between systems? Probably not. But anyway, second aspect, standard. Third aspect, framework. A framework is more of a library or an implementation that handles authorization. It doesn't have to be a standard necessarily. Ruby has a framework called can. There's Open Policy Agent, like I said, is borderline standard framework. There's OSOHQ, which is a framework. I'm sure WSO2 that had a couple of libraries that could tackle authorization without necessarily being standards based. Java has Java Authentication Authorization Service. There's many different ways to skin the authorization cat. Not that any cat was harmed in this presentation, but it's important to distinguish between model, standard, and framework, and we'll see what that means in the following slide. This is kind of the lay of the land as it stands today. And this is a diagram that could keep growing and growing and growing, especially in the framework side of things on the right-hand side. So if we read it from left to right, what you have is standards in blue. And within standards, you have essentially three big families, IETF, first and foremost, who own a lot of the identity standards. You have also the OpenID Foundation that I haven't listed here. You have Oasis, who own both SAML and XAML. They're same age. They were both founded in 2001. And then you have NIST and Kantara that define other standards like NGAC for NIST and UMA for Kantara. And then in terms of models, it's a little simpler. Here in models, we have essentially ACLs, RBAC, and ABAC. What's really nice is that NIST took the effort of formalizing what RBAC and ABAC are. They have a great set of resources on both frameworks. I would really recommend to anyone here interested that they go look at the ABAC special publication that NIST released back in 2013, if memory serves correctly, because it does define a lot of the basic requirements for authorization. You also have frameworks, right? So as I mentioned, you have Open Policy Agent that belongs to CNCF. You have vendor-specific frameworks. AWS has a great ABAC framework to control access to the different resources you have within AWS. Microsoft have something called SDDL, and there's many others. So Google have their own version of ABAC for GCP, and there's many other frameworks. And to go back to your point, Prabhath, earlier, every SaaS has the potential to define their own authorization framework. So I could have literally listed Salesforce as an example of a vendor here. And then there's industry standards as well. And that's kind of interesting because they can define best practices for the industry. So if you're in healthcare, for instance, you have HL7, and then within HL7, you have something called FHIR. That defines how you want to drive authorization for a particular industry. And it might even give you some best practices or references in terms of implementation as well. So it's always worth looking at industry standards to see what can be done or what has been done already in that space.
Yeah, why you think, David, like,
Yep.
so you said like, so AWS has their own policy language.
Yep.
Salesforce, you have your own one. So why you think like if you take SAML, OpenID Connect, like everyone is using that and they are not worrying about implementing their own authentication or federation protocols. But why not for authorization? Why everyone is not using, let's say, SACML, for example? Do we see
everyone should be using XAML. I think so. There's a couple of different things. First of all, part of it comes from the need for interop. If you're doing authentication and if you're doing federation, interop is important. So SAML, in a way, is way more critical than getting one standard for authorization because you have to plug in all those applications together. Same thing with the LDAP, before federation. Same thing with OpenID Connect and OAuth. Now, there's another aspect, of course. It's easier to agree between us on what identity is and what identity attributes we need right? We're going to have a first name, a last name, a username, an email, potentially a role or multiple roles. So it's easier to agree on a basic schema for identity. It's much harder to agree on a schema for authorization. So XACML is a general purpose language, but every time you have a general purpose language, it makes the language harder to understand, harder to write with, okay? If you look at AWS ABAC, it's a language that is tailored to AWS's needs. Wow, tongue twister. So it's all about controlling access to resources within the AWS environment. If you look at Google, same thing. So essentially, it's a constrained version of what a broader authorization framework should do. It's always easier to adopt and handle and manage and audit a constrained framework because there's fewer options essentially. But it means that you can't reuse it across all of your applications. So I think that's kind of the reason why XACML hasn't been as widespread and successful as say SAML. It's because it's too general purpose, and then every single app you're going to is going to have different requirements.
Yeah, and also we have seen like even though XACML is standard, the way you implement it, like for example, so as you said, right, so authorization requirements are way more complex than what we see in the authentication domain.
Yep.
People build their own policy information points, PIPs.
Yeah.
Which are coupled for like vendors interfaces. So you cannot just like lift and shift these policies from one vendor to another vendor because you are very much coupled to their implementation.
Yeah, that's true. And so there's actually two things to what you said. So number one, the standard only goes so far. So things like PIPs are going to be vendor specific, which, I mean, that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. But the other thing, though, is shifting and lifting your policies and moving from one vendor to another vendor. How often does that happen?
Yeah.
In my 10 years in my previous life, I think it happened twice. Yeah. So the standard, I think, is important whenever there's like a request response, there's an interaction between a client and an application, right? So the way you ask the authorization question, that needs to be standardized. But the way you implement the underlying fuel or the underlying policy, if you will, that doesn't really matter. You know, the analogy you could draw is if you're driving a car, the steering wheel, that has to be standard because you're going to go for the user, you're going to go from one car to another car. So you want to recognize the dashboard and the steering wheel and the turn signals and all that. That's got to be more or less standardized. The fuel in the car, though, if it's diesel or gas or something else or electric, that shouldn't change your experience. It's kind of the same thing. What fuels the engine shouldn't really doesn't need to be as standard as the interface.
Yeah. So so basically, like XACML is very powerful. Like so, when I talk to like some of WSO's customers those days.
Yep.
So if they ask a question like, "Can this be done XACML?" Then what I'm going to tell is, XACML is very powerful, and if you think that you cannot do this in XACML, go and reread the XACML. You'll be able to do it. But I think from the negative side, it's complex too, and probably I think Axiomatics did it right, like implementing the tools around the policy language. But the getting exposed to plain XACML, the like XML stuff, it's been tough to understand. And even for a small thing, you need to like have a lot of lines.
That's a really good point. And I think one of the failures of XACML is being a language that is not easy to write by hand. It's a language that is very powerful. Yes, they could do pretty much anything in terms of authorization, absolutely, but can't be written by hand by the developers. And one of the challenges with authorization actually is, where do you start on the spectrum? Do you start talking to the developers down below who are writing the app, or do you talk to the business owners at the very top? You know, is it a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach? XACML was probably more of a top-down, and then the new languages that are coming out, OSO HQ with Polar, Open Policy Agent and Rego, all these are more bottom-up. They started with a language that developers are comfortable writing in, and now you can go up to the business owner. So maybe the two are going to meet in the middle ultimately, where you're going to have a good management layer that's going to be able to do all the governance of your policies, but the developers will be capable of writing the policies themselves by hand. That's also super important.
Yeah.
Oops. So here's a timeline. I'm not going to go through it, but just I think the bottom line from this timeline is that fine-grained authorization ABAC is a very old challenge. ZACML is, dates back to 2001, very much part of the SOA craze and then the API craze, very much in line with what SAML was doing. And now, if you look at the newer initiatives, Open Policy Agent, Zanzibar, OSO HQ, and then even within the identity world, there's things like rich authorization requests on the right and far right-hand side that are trying to bridge identity to authorization. So it's a very, very much a thriving environment, and I'm looking forward to what's going to happen in the next couple of years. So I mentioned NIST. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, great institution. They've been very fundamental and helpful in establishing the foundation for ABAC. So initially started in '92, and then it was published in 2004, and then they followed suit with ABAC, published in 2013, and then they came up with their own standard called NGAC. NGAC is interesting in that it takes a graph-based approach to authorization. So it's kind of like using relationships. What's interesting in there is that because graph is already a world that exists with a lot of tooling around it, building authorization on top of graph might be a way to actually get a lot of the benefits of graph applied to authorization. So that's something that is worth keeping an eye out, and I have another slide on that towards the end. But again, go to this website, check out the resources, really good resources. Now, if we look at one of the major buckets of authorization, it's all about identity-derived authorization, which is all fine and well, but it's only one part of the equation. Remember the Venn diagram? It's only one circle. So within identity-derived authorization, you have, of course, SAML, you have user-managed access, you have OAuth, you have rich authorization requests, you have dot access tokens, and then you have GNAP or GNAP. You'll have to ask the founder of GNAP how it's pronounced. When I asked him, I think he said it's pronounced just like GIF. And he was writing to me, so that didn't help because he wrote, it's just like GIF. And I'm like, well, how do you pronounce GIF? Is it GIF or GIF? Anyway, all of these are great to bridge between identity and authorization, but in their own little bubble, they're not sufficient because they only tackle the end identity side of authorization. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into the different standards. I'm just going to talk very briefly about this one here, rich authorization requests. This is actually kind of cool. It helps bridge between OAuth and OpenID Connect and a policy decision point, be it Open Policy Agent or ZACML or whatever. Because with a rich authorization request, what you can do is send an authorization request from the authorization server in OAuth to a policy decision point, get a decision back, and then decide whether you want to issue an access token or not issue an access token. And it can be combined with scopes and claims in OAuth and OpenID Connect, so it can actually help enrich the authorization flow. So really interesting initiative. Currently a draft. Currently, the team is currently working on it, so that's something to keep an eye out for. Here's what it looks like. So very similar to what a ZACML JSON request looks like, or what an Open Policy Agent request looks like. Another one that I want to mention briefly is UMA. UMA, or User Managed Access, is really about letting users define what can happen. And letting essentially control of cross-party sharing. So if Alice wants to share medical data with Bob, for instance, that there's a way to define how that can happen. And then policy languages like OPA and OSO and ZACML can actually read UMA configuration and use that to determine whether access should be granted. Again, that's great. It addresses the user side of authorization. So remember when I said authorization can be defined both by the enterprise and by the user, UMA is definitely in the user category. Okay, so here's an example. Let's walk through this. King Arthur wants to share data with Lancelot. So King Arthur hires Lancelot, shares the data with Lancelot. Lancelot gets access to the data. And then Arthur and Lancelot have a fight over Guinevere, of course. Arthur unshares the data from Lancelot in one step through UMA, and therefore Lancelot loses access to the data. And best of all, there's an audit trail, so Arthur can actually prove to Merlin that it did happen. So this is essentially what UMA is helping you enable. Okay, So some of the limitations, though, of identity-centric authorization is it's very much the limitations that we find in ABAC. You can't use relationships, or at least you cannot use relationships that span across the user and the entity that you're trying to get access to. Yes, it's easier to manage because it's all in one bucket. You know, remember what I said at the very beginning, is the enterprise IT team that's going to be able to handle all of the identity and the ABAC authorization. But it's not going to be fine-grained enough. It's going to be very static. You're not going to have the context or the entity part of your Venn diagram. It's also design time, so it's not runtime. So these are all of the limitations of identity-centric authorization, which would be okay in a smaller, simpler world with fewer users and less data. But as we're enriching our environment, as we're increasing the number of APIs and microservices, we need something a little bit better. And so we need to move away from ABAC, where you have your role explosion and you have your scope explosion and your token bloats, to ABAC. With that being said, moving from ABAC to ABAC is not easy. A lot of developers and architects have suffered on the bridge of death. And if you don't know what your favorite color is or what the air velocity of a swallow is, yes, you're gonna have a hard time moving to to ABAC. So one of the methods that I put in place when I was doing this is to take it in a step-by-step process, and it's a circle, okay? So number one, you want to identify your basic requirements. I want to build an app to browse bank accounts, for instance. From there, you derive the authorization requirements, okay? A user can view their own accounts. From there, you identify the attributes or the key words in those authorization requirements. It could be the owner of the account, it could be the balance, it could be the location, it could be the status, and so forth. Then you implement your policies in whatever language rocks your boat: Alpha, ZACWL, OPA, OSO. All languages have pros and cons. Prabhath, you were pointing out that ZACWL is very heavyweight, but it can express anything. That's true. OPA is a little bit more developer friendly. Polar and OSO is also a little bit more developer friendly. Alpha is kind of, in my biased view, the best of both worlds. It's as flexible as ZACWL, but it's as easy to write, even easier to write than Rego. Then from there, you can design and deploy your architecture, and then you can actually run your audits. So that's kind of the sort of the life cycle that you want to go through. So in ABAC, what ABAC defines, the NIST ABAC model, it defines that you have, number one, a language. Number two, a set of attributes that you can tie together in that language, or the language, the policy. And number three, you're going to have a request response pattern, how you ask a question, how you get a response back. You have an architecture that defines how to deploy essentially your ABAC model, and a pattern to fetch additional attributes. So what you were referring to as PIPs, policy information points, Prabhath, that's also defined in ABAC. So that gives us an architecture that looks like this. This is the diagram that comes straight from Wikipedia. So you'll recognize terms like PEP, PDP, PAP, PIP. They predate ZACWL, they predate ABAC. They were used in other environments. They're just recycled here. But essentially in ABAC, and this diagram is true whether you go down the path of ZACWL or OPA or OSO, it's very much the same pattern, more or less. Here you have a user trying to get access to a resource. You have a PEP, or policy enforcement point, intercepting the flow, delegating the authorization check to a policy decision point. The policy decision point looks at policies it's been configured with, and potentially looks up additional attributes to decide whether yes or no access should be granted. This is perfect for functional authorization and transactional authorization. Any questions on this diagram?
Yes. So David, you talked about ABAC, RBAC, and policy-based access control.
Yep.
So, so I've seen people talking about these three at the same level. Or do you think they are at the same level, or policy-based access control is orthogonal to ABAC and RBAC?
No. So PBAC is one of those terms that was kind of invented. It's a bit of a shame. PBAC is ABAC. So RBAC and ABAC are really the two terms you want to focus on, right? That were defined by NIST. RBAC is very much identity-centric authorization. ABAC is broader authorization that considers multiple parameters, multiple dimensions. PBAC, so when you say ABAC, the term focuses on attributes. Maybe PBAC would have been a better term for it because you focus on the policy. But the bottom line is it's the same thing, right? PBAC and ABAC.
But the policy can be either attribute based, so role based or anything.
Well, so that's a really good point. In ABAC, you consider the role to be just another attribute.
Yeah.
So yeah, the policy can be role-based, it could be attribute-based, it could be role-structured as well. So you could actually re-implement your RBAC inside of a policy and then little by little pepper in additional attributes to make it richer than what it used to be. Yep.
Sure, got it. Thanks.
So we talked a lot about ZACML. I'm not gonna delve too much into ZACML. It's my favorite language, of course, for better or for worse. It's been around since 2001, very much stemmed from the whole SOA/API world and WS star group of standards. It's very mature, very complete. It's also XML based. So for those of you who are allergic to XML, it's probably not going to be your favorite cup of tea. And it's also been killed a bunch of times. Like a bunch of analysts said that ZACML was dead. Maybe in some way the syntax is dead, but like I said, we already established that how you write your policy doesn't really matter. What matters is how easy it is for a developer to write the policy, how easy it is to manage the policy, so on and so forth. But here's ZACML. Here's the first one. The second thing that came along in my diagram is alpha. Alpha is pretty much like ZACML. It is what I would consider the better ZACML. It uses a similar structure, a simplified structure, and then it's developer friendly. This is what a sample policy looks like in alpha. It's much easier to write and understand than what XML would have been. Okay. You have NGAC. NGAC is interesting. However, it is more of an R&D initiative by NIST. So I haven't seen a lot of industry adoption for NGAC, unfortunately. It's still good to have a read and understand how they tackle relationships and how they use graph to express those relationships. So there's a lot of good food for thought in there. But in terms of adoption, I haven't really seen it much out there. OPA is kind of one of the, I was going to say new hot items. It's not really new anymore because it's been around since 2015 or 2016, if I remember correctly. But it did graduate from incubator in 2021. OPA is an engine. Rego is the language that you use to configure that engine. And one of the cool things is that because it stems from the microservices world, it's very much adapted to microservices, and it's pretty much almost built into the microservices environment. So to adapt it to your microservices is really a piece of cake. They have an extremely vibrant community as well. So if you ever need help to write policies, they have people helping you. They have a Slack workspace for that. So that's kind of one of the newer initiatives out there. Now, there's another one here that I didn't mention, which is in the slides, because when I wrote the slides, I did not have enough information. That's OSO and Polar, which is another library for tackling authorization that has a language sort of similar-ish to what Rego and Open Policy Agent is. Now, some of the key differences between Alpha and Open Policy Agent is that in ABAC, you have this notion of a PIP to retrieve attributes, like you said, Prabhath. Open Policy Agent doesn't really have that. They kind of address it after the fact. So now you can retrieve attributes in OPA, but it wasn't planned from the get-go. And then the language is very flat in OPA, which makes it simpler to write for sure, but also harder to scale and harder to organize. So that these are a couple of differences that I've noticed. There is something else that could be cool to do, which is an OPA profile for ZACML, because OPA has so many different integrations with applications you want to protect. If you could actually send an OPA request to a ZACML policy decision point and get the policy decision point to reply, then you could actually use both languages interchangeably, and that would be actually kind of cool.
Yeah, I think that would be just a REST API call, right? So ZACML has the REST PIP interface.
Yeah,
PDP interface. So
PDP interface. Yep.
PDP, yeah. So basically, you can talk to REST code. There's a question, David. You talked earlier about central management layer for audit. For companies you have dealt with, is that another custom interface or something that's purchased? What does that typically include?
So in my past life, when you were doing audits and access reviews, you would either, so they're slightly different. The answers are going to be different. For audits, and you're looking at audit logs and the logs of access granted or denied, you just plug in a Splunk and you build your reports that way, or another equivalent of Splunk, right? It's basic log analysis, and you can determine how many permits, how many denies, all that stuff. Okay, and that answer is going to be true whether it's ZAC role or Open Policy Agent or anything else. Now, I'm sure there's companies like Axiomatics or like Styra, or also who are building their own solutions so that you don't have to rely on a Splunk. But generally, if you already have a log analysis tool, it should be good enough to tackle that part of the audit. The second part, the access review part, that's a little trickier. There are tools, governance tools like SailPoint, for instance, that will help you do governance if you can plug your policies into those frameworks. But other than that, it does require policy language knowledge. So you're going to have to rely on what the vendors do, the Styra, the build policy, the Axiomatics, in terms of governance tooling around the policy language.
Yeah, thanks.
But it does point, though, Prabhath, it points to something interesting. The secret sauce and the value is not necessarily anymore in the engine. It's more in everything around the engine. So the governance layer, like I have on my slide, or the integrations, or the management, or the lifecycle, or the version control, everything around the maintenance, essentially, of the authorization is going to be the secret sauce that's going to make you choose one framework or one vendor over another one.
That's right. Yeah, that's what we have seen is like, so engine can be powerful, but that is good to test something, but in practice, the management layer, how do you govern policies?
Yep.
How do you audit policies? So that becomes the key in production.
Yep. My analogy for this is when you fly a plane, a 737 or whatever it might be, as a pilot, you interface with the cockpit, right? And the way the cockpit is laid out matters a lot because it's going to change your flying experience. But the engines are interchangeable. You could buy a 737 with a Pratt & Whitney or a Rolls-Royce or a GE engine. Now, the fact that you have different engines, yes, it might change things like the thrust of your plane, but it doesn't change the actual cockpit. Okay, so that's what matters is the cockpit, not so much the engine.
Yeah, I think Style has done that for OPA, like, so they have their own control plane. Yeah.
Yep. And it also opens up a whole other world of possibility. Historically, many companies were reluctant to do authorization SaaS because they wanted to have authorization on premise. And I don't know if that's going to change in the near term, but if the control plane is what matters, the control plane could become a SaaS. And then the enforcement and the decision-making could still be on premise.
Yeah, but do you think that in recently, like even Auth0 has started like exploring this authorization domain? Probably they'll come up with like SaaS for authorization.
Yeah.
Even some other companies like exploring to build this SaaS layer for authorization. We haven't seen in the past, right? So even though you decouple it, still it's on-prem.
Yeah, well, so it's a really good point. And the identity companies that have gone SaaS, like Auth0, like Okta, and there's many more I'm forgetting, they are now expanding into the authorization world. So Auth0 is working on an initiative in their Auth0 labs based on Zanzibar. If you Google them, you'll find what they're working on. So yeah, we're little by little moving there. But I do think there might be room for this hybrid model where the governance layer, the management layer, the control plane, like you said, is a SaaS. It's kind of what Styra is doing, right? And then the enforcement, the decision-making is still in the apps or next to the apps as a sidecar.
Yeah.
So here's a slide that kind of ties everything together. I know we're very close to time, so I'll try to be fast. But what's cool is that you can actually mix and match. So you can mix a traditional PDP alpha or XACL PDP with an open policy agent. You can plug in UMA as a policy information point. You could plug in an OAuth authorization server through rich authorization requests, and then you could get access to all of the applications you want to protect. So I think there's a lot of really neat patterns that have yet to be developed. Okay. So challenges with ABAC and some of the things that have made ABAC hard to adopt is really because the language is too general purpose. It forces you to use PIPs. I mean, it's both a good and a bad thing, but if you use PIPs, someone's got to define the attributes. Someone's got to maintain the attributes. Okay, auditing becomes harder as well. You know, I did mention that you can do audits of what happened and what can happen, but auditing when everything's sat within your Active Directory or within your identity team, it was easier because you had one place to go to. Now you have multiple places to go to. Okay, of challenges, how do you ask open-ended questions? So Open Policy Agent has something called partial evaluation. Axiomatics, of course, has reverse query. The head of Twitter was talking about this reverse indexable feature of a language. So this is what really matters, you know, things that have to be tackled by the language that you choose, okay? The bottom line, though, I would say is that standards are great, but standards are great to define, say, the interactions, the interoperability, and potentially the policy language. But then there's a lot of things around the language, like essentially the life cycle of the policies, the management of the policies, the governance of the policies, that are going to be addressed in proprietary ways. Prabhath, you were mentioning Styra. Absolutely, they're doing their own layer. Axiomatics is doing their own layer. Build policy, they're doing their own layer. So absolutely, yep. So here's another example of how you can tie OAuth with ABAC through rich authorization requests, through the authorization server as well. It doesn't have to be a rich authorization request. ABAC can deliver dynamically generated claims that can be inserted inside of an access token that can be returned back to an application. Here's RAR. All right, and I think this is one of my last few slides. Zanzibar is something that's come up lately. It's a model that was defined by Google a couple of years ago. There's a great paper on Zanzibar out there that you can reference to. I think I might have a few links in the slides at the end. Zanzibar is more of an access control list model. And the driver for Zanzibar was really authorization at scale, but more importantly, the definition of authorization and the propagation of authorization through access control lists at scale. And originally, Google did it for YouTube, Google Drive, all of the Google services, where if you were adding and removing people from a list, you could propagate that across all of their services extremely quickly, okay? It's still very much so about user-defined authorization, but there are companies like Auth0, if you look at one of the last bullets on this slide, that are taking Zanzibar, and Auth0 also is taking Zanzibar and trying to adapt it to ABAC requirements. So this is also a space that you want to keep an eye on in terms of what authorization is going to become. Okay, and I did mention graph authorization as well. So this is something that's is happening. So there's NGAC. There's a company called Nully that's working on graph-based authorization as well. So one of my friends and neighbors actually works for Nully and is working on graph authorization. So that's him and me on one of our Holy Grail quests a few months ago. What's really interesting with graph is that graph already comes with tooling that potentially could be adapted to authorization. So I want to see whether that can give us a head start in tackling authorization in a much more efficient way. Okay. And on that note, authorization is a very, very vibrant environment. It's changing all the time. Vendors are coming up with new solutions. Standards is still evolving as well. So keep an eye on this space. At the end of the day, if you're in the business of buying a solution, what you really want to look at is how easy it is to write policies, manage policies, version control your policies, and audit your policies. This is what's going to matter first, most of all, right? The basic requirements really that you want to address is that your framework should be developer-minded. It should be relevant, meaning that you have integrations with applications that you want to protect. It should also be business-oriented. So that's kind of the tricky thing to crack, right? If it's developer-minded, can it also be business-oriented? And the answer is hopefully yes, right? It should be audit-enabled. It should be reverse indexable, and it should have lifecycle and governance built into it. Okay. And then just a big shout out to all of the people that actually helped me put this presentation together. It actually took me a while to put it together for the conference in June, and I'm happy that I had a chance to present it again today. But these are all great people in the authorization world. If you want to dig deeper, I'm happy to talk to you, but you could also reach out to these individuals who have a lot of insights into how authorization is going to evolve. And then some additional resources. And like I said, these slides are available online, so you can go ahead and I can share the link with you, and you can look at them, download them, rehash them, be my guest.
Yeah, thanks, David. So there's one question related to the analogy that you brought up related to the control plane.
Yep.
Is cockpit just for custom maps or across all pieces of technology at a company, including IAS, and SAS?
My analogy was only for the authorization piece, but you're right that it could be extended to other pieces of the technology stack. Now, the challenge is the bigger the cockpit, the more confusing it gets. So I think there's probably some benefit into segmenting your cockpit into different realms so that you don't get overwhelmed.
Sure. And anything that you can share with us, like out of all the standards and technologies that you talked here, anything that you are using at Salesforce, anything that you can, only if you can share?
Yeah, so I'm not in the authorization team. I know that Salesforce has a very rich authorization model that is based on multiple different layers, all the way from a hierarchy of roles that you can define to being able to define permissions on different items. We do have documentation on that, so I could actually share it with you. We use this thing called Trailhead, which is like fun education, if you will, and there's a trail on authorization and how it's handled at Salesforce. So I could definitely share that with everyone.
Sure. Yeah, thanks a lot, David. I think this is a very useful, extremely informative session. There's a lot of praise on YouTube comments too.
Cool.
Thanks a lot for taking your time to share your experience with us. And
You bet.
thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and looking forward to see you in our next meetup.